Welcome to the first Motown Exile YouTube channel broadcast. My name's Ryan. So let me do some quick framing here. This is not a hate video. This is a standards video. The core question that I'm going to talk about today is, has Brad Holmes actually improved the Detroit Lions, or are we confusing vibes with results? He promised that he had receipts, but we're going to look at the drafts, we're going to look at roster holes, we're going to look at accountability, and of course, we're going to also look at Brad's leadership behavior, because that's a very important part of the context for what it leads to having a winning organization in anything, especially in the National Football League in this day and age. So a little bit about myself. My name's Ryan, as I mentioned at the beginning. I am a teacher by trade, but I am also a huge Detroit Lions fan. I'm a Michigan native. I grew up in Port Huron, Michigan, and I used to have a background in sports broadcasting back at the end of the 20th century. And you can tell by the white hair and this beard here that I'm a little bit older than I was back when I did that. But it was a great experience. I enjoyed that work a lot. And now I live in Arizona. I've actually lived in Arizona twice. I've lived in Oregon. And so I kind of have that outside perspective of still considering Michigan home, but also what it's like to be on the outside looking in, so to speak, and not around all Lions fans, all fans of the Michigan sports teams every day of the week. So wanted to ask you, if you like this show, please hit the like button. Also, if you would be so kind as to subscribe. My goal is to have 1,000 subscribers by February the 1st, 2026. So first, let's look at the positive things that have happened for the Lions since their first season when Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell took over. Let's start with the big hits. So that very first player drafted, Penei Sewell, he was a foundation setter. Looks like he could potentially be on a Hall of Fame course. Other potential Hall of Famer, Amon-Ra St. Brown, fourth round steal. The next year they get Aiden Hutchinson, but great GMs don't live off highlights. They live off depth, development, and accountability. So my first claim here is that the roster has plateaued. The team's not meaningfully improving year after year. Some core weaknesses are reappearing. The defensive inconsistency, pass rush disappears against good teams, and the offensive line, they had to have some clue that Frank Ragnow was going to be retiring. However, they did little to address that position. And if you recall, Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell both said, "We're good." That was their response when asked about adding help on the edge. And obviously, they didn't do enough on the offensive line. Continuity is great. However, until it becomes complacency, that's a big problem. So that's one of the things that I see Brad Holmes and his issues with the Detroit Lions. Another thing that I'm seeing is, I call it the mad scientist drafting philosophy. Holmes seems to prioritize certain traits in his drafts, and I have no problem with that. However, in the last couple of years, he's experimented quite a bit. And he's taken guys, I look at guys who haven't panned out, even from his original drafts, like Josh Paschal. I also look at guys like Giovanni Manu. I questioned the logic at the time of taking a guy who played 1 year of football in British Columbia and using a pick on him. He has not panned out to date. I hope he does, but he hasn't worked out so far. Another pattern I see is, in addition to the developmental projects, there's a lot of position switches. You draft Vaki, who was a safety at Utah, and then you turn him into a running back who hardly ever gets a carry, and once in a while plays on special teams. He was returning kicks, not doing much. And also just looking at raw athletes over refined players. I think that has really shown in the lack of depth this season, and it's got to be something that they addressed going forward. At some point, upside becomes an excuse, and I think that right now that the Lions have too many players who have what he might term upside, but they're not panning out. And in the last 2 years, especially, when you look at depth and lack thereof, that's been a huge problem, especially when you look at the secondary and his inability to hit on those folks. There's been some draft busts, missed opportunities. Again, too much premium on picks who aren't contributing. Too much focus on process. And it's not a personal attack. High draft capital, with low impact, players unavailable, buried, or ineffective. The cost, who else was on the board? Positions of need ignored, key phrase. I mean, bus don't kill teams, patterns do. And that's the Brad Holmes way. I think that would be a very accurate way to describe what he's done so far in the last few years in his role as general manager. This is one of my biggest ones, and this hits at the leadership piece of it. You know, leadership disappears when questions get uncomfortable. And we have not seen Brad Holmes in front of a microphone or answer to reporters since August. No press conferences since August. Fans, media, experts, folks that follow the team, we're left guessing, trying to compare, other strong front offices. Accountability does not equal weakness. It does not. When you make mistakes, you have to own that first. I know that as a person who's had some practice in leadership, and as a person who's coached people in leadership as well. Brad Holmes, come on, step in front of the mic, answer some questions, help us understand your thinking. If you got nothing to hide, that's what you need to do. Fans will respect you for it. Transparency isn't optional when expectations are high. A lot of people have invested sweat equity and blood equity into this team. I often talk to my father, who's in his 70s. I'm going to be 50 years old in February. Man, I don't want to be one of those people in hospice who ends up, hoping that the Lions win one for the Gipper, because that's not what we're looking for. We deserve better, and we want better. Another part that I want to focus on, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, the edge rusher blind spot. A contender cannot ignore the edge position. There have been repeated failures to draft high-end edge help, trade for proven pass rushers, spend meaningfully in free agency, and now the defense collapse in big moments. You don't win in January without wrecking the quarterbacks, and that's been a big problem. Now, you can look statistically at Aiden Hutchinson, and you can also look at El-Quadin Muhammad, and yeah, they've had nice seasons, but it doesn't seem to happen when they need it, especially this year when the defensive backfield has just been ravaged by injuries, and they really, really need to get that pass rush going, and it just hasn't been there. And there have been good players passed over. Again, last year, I really like Isaac Tesla. Seems like he's going to be a really good player. You give up 2 future third-round draft picks. I mean, there's guys on the board who could help the team this year. And I mean, that's kind of the point leading into the next claim. Arrogance and optics matter. Confidence is earned. Arrogance is premature. I go back to the villain hoodies that he's worn at press conferences, talking about keeping receipts when people have questioned his draft picks and those players have worked out, thinking specifically of Jahmyr Gibbs. The other thing that this might not bother some people, but I don't want to see Brad Holmes wearing his college jersey, or anyone else in the Lions front office or organization wearing that jersey. Wearing his college jersey on draft day is just silly. And it looks like he's trying to be one of the boys. Brad, you're not one of the boys. You're the general manager. Your responsibility is to put talent on this team and help your coaches. Blowing 17-point lead in the NFC Championship game a couple of years ago, you don't want that to be your high point, Brad. You don't. So big picture question here is Brad Holmes, is he a great evaluator who's hit a ceiling, or a GM confusing culture and cleverness with results? Have something to do in developing that talent, not leave them empty-handed and try to make you look good. And I don't want to see those jerseys again. They're stupid, and you just look stupid wearing them. Act like the villain after you've beaten the heroes, not before. This is a big fork in the road moment for this team. The next 12 to 18 months will define his legacy, and it's time for a big call to action. This episode of this podcast is about standards, not loyalty tests. And am I wrong? Have I been wrong? Have I said anything wrong? Where am I dead wrong? You tell me. I'm open to comments. I'm open to feedback. I'm open to constructive criticism. That helps me get better. And that's my goal. I want to continue to get better at this. I want to be a leading voice for you to go to for your Lions news and information and opinion. This channel is for Lions fans who want honesty, not pom-poms. Like, subscribe, comment below. I'd love to hear back from you. Again, Happy New Year. I hope that you are all well and in good health. I hope that you remember somebody out there loves you, and take care, and we'll talk to you next time.